Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our seminar today. Our panel is going to be talking about gardening in New Hampshire. Whether you are here in the state or you're thinking of moving, New England is a little quirky compared to other parts of the country. But in other respects, it's absolutely fantastic for gardening here. My name's Kate Muller. I've been here for 5 years, almost 6, and I do a lot of small, intensive, urban-style gardening, raised beds, and lots of containers. And then I have help today from 2 of my friends who do much bigger gardening. So here is Dawn.
Hi, I'm Dawn Lincoln. I live in Westmoreland, southwest corner. Hi, Edie. And I do a pretty big gardening. I have a 60 by 60 fenced-in garden with raised beds. I have a greenhouse my neighbors gave me, which is really cool, and a lot of berries, strawberries, raspberries, blueberries, asparagus, rhubarb, et cetera, on my perennial beds. And let John introduce himself.
I'm John Babiarz. I'm John Babiarz, and my background's engineering. Been in Grafton for 20 years, and I've raised a commercial greenhouse for 3 years. And now I have 2 experimental greenhouses that I'm advancing horticulture without government subsidies, but also I have an acre in production of beans, various brassica, and strawberries. In fact, there are advantages to greenhouses, and because of New Hampshire's short growing season, you may want to consider that.
You want to go next? Sure. Where do we want to start? At the top? Yeah. So one of the things about gardening in New Hampshire is, what can you grow in New Hampshire? Well, you can grow just about everything in New Hampshire except your real tropical things. You've got your early spring crops. You can put in your lettuce and your peas. They say as soon as you can work the ground. So sometimes that could be in April, especially if you're working with raised beds, because the soil dries faster and gets warmer quicker. And you can grow your warm things. You have to start them inside a lot. Your tomatoes and things like that, you have to start early or buy transplants, but much cheaper to do them yourself.
Yeah, one of the things about gardening in New Hampshire is that you do need to start your seeds early and under lights, because most New England houses, particularly anyone with a modern windows, your windows don't get enough sunlight to keep them growing. They'll get long and spindly. So starting your seedlings under, say, fluorescent lights or other grow lights will actually guarantee that you get good, healthy seedlings by the time you need to put them in ground, unless you have a greenhouse.
Seeds normally take 7 to 10 days for the enzyme on the seeds to break down so the plant starts its cycle. In a greenhouse, we have propagation chambers, and we can drastically reduce that to a 3-day period. And then we can put everything in a controlled environment. And the advantage of that is we can have rapid turnaround of our produce and whatever we're growing. We're not reliant on Mother Nature. We actually control our situation to every last aspect. Some plants, if you go just below 68 degrees, they stop growing. Your tomatoes, the minute it goes below 68 degrees, they actually stop their process of fruiting, adding sugar to the fruit, and other things like that. And in a commercial greenhouse, we're aware of that and maintain that temperature. I think one of the biggest mistakes a lot of people who go into the either greenhouse business without the proper training or even beginner gardeners is the importance of ventilation for the plant. If you have stagnant air, you're going to have botrytis, all sorts of fungus infections that will kill your seedling or make them spiny. And if they're spiny, they're not strong enough to take a good growing cycle. So a good rule of thumb is you always want ventilation. If it's too dry, then the plant is not going to be suitable, that when you introduce it to the outside, and if you don't do it properly, you'll kill off your seedlings. So it's very important that the plants, during the initial part, is they take a slow, steady, think of wind as exercise for plants.
So one of the reasons it's really important to start seedlings if you're growing from seed in New Hampshire is we have very peculiar springs. They're very wet, they're very cold, but they can have nice hot days in the middle of very cold, rainy day, in between cold, rainy times of the season. So you really want to keep your seedlings you don't want to set them out early unless they're a cold hardy crop. So some things like a lot of us are having a little trouble with our tomatoes, eggplants, and peppers for them, keeping them happy because we've had an unusually cold and wet spring that's run very, very late. There are parts of New Hampshire that had snow Memorial Day weekend. So our growing season is definitely different than, say, the Mid-Atlantic or the Midwest, the southern part of the Midwest, or the East Coast for that matter. One of the things he talks about why it's really important not to have spindly seedlings or disease seedlings, because of our damp, wet springs, we tend to have a lot of things like molds and funguses that love this wet, wet soil in the spring, and they'll just kill off your seedlings.
And another reason to start your own seeds, besides the cost, of course, it's a lot less expensive to buy a pack of seeds, and it's even less expensive when you do a little co-op with some of your friends, and you buy seed packages together and split them up. From a company like Fedco Seeds in Maine, they pride themselves on carrying non-GMO seeds, heirloom seeds, open pollinated, as well as hybrids. And the open pollinated seeds are ones that you can save, which is another way you can save money if you want to save your own seeds, and those will make true the plant that you just grew, as opposed to the hybrids, which not really sure what you're going to get if you plant those. And there's a number of ways to keep your other costs down with starting seeds. Containers, you can reuse them. Use yogurt containers, strawberry containers, just punch some holes in the bottom, as long as they get holes in the bottom, because bottom watering is a really good way to grow your plants so that the roots will come down to find the water, which you want them to do in the soil, especially if it's dry. If the roots are up at the top, the plants are going to suffer. And Kate's been doing a really cool thing with starting seeds.
So one of the things that I've been looking, and there are a lot of great, Fedco's one of them, but there are a lot of great local, small, family-owned seed suppliers in northern New England, Vermont, Maine. There might be a few in New Hampshire, but I'm not exactly sure. One of them is Johnny Selected Seeds, which I picked up a soil cube maker. So instead of finding and making all the old yogurt containers into seedlings, I've been doing the soil cube, and that's been great because I can fit 60 seedlings in a tray. There's no extra plastic or extra parts that I have to wash out every year. And then when the roots grow, they just kind of fill the little soil block, and it makes them super easy to transplant. And one of the things about, say, starting seeds, or the other thing I really do, is container gardening. I have a mostly shady yard, so I'm very limited. I can't do a yard. I don't have an acre. I've got 21 by 22 feet. So I've got 3 raised beds, and I also do the containers. The containers I put in my driveway, so during the summer we park one of the cars on the street. And potting mix, you can buy pre-made potting mixes, you can mix your own. One that works really well up here is compost, peat moss, a little perlite or vermiculite, and then some soil amendments, which I happen to like, green sand, lime, and a little rock phosphate, and with a little Epsom salt. But John will explain the Epsom salt. And it works great in my area, which am in the Merrimack Valley in Manchester, so I actually have a much slightly warmer and longer growing season than either of these guys, especially John. And so I can get away with, in the containers, putting out things a little earlier and then tucking them inside when it gets cold this time of the year. And so hopefully I'll have tomatoes mid-July.
In a commercial greenhouse, we tend to avoid soils that are not, quote, manufactured, if you will. Most greenhouses for selling plants actually sell soil that is basically peat moss. And that pH of the peat moss initially is around 4.5 to 5.0, and then they add micronutrients to start the plants. When we grow commercially, we tend to do bottom-up watering as a new technique. I do drip irrigation and timers. A greenhouse, you would spend all day just watering, just keeping up with it if you didn't use drip irrigation. An advantage of drip irrigation is you water at the soil. There are certain plants that are sensitive to having water on their leaves, and the other rule of thumb is you never water at night in the greenhouse. You got to make sure the plants dry themselves off, otherwise you're prone to bacterium. I think the other thing to realize is you can recycle the soil. Most commercial operations will recycle it over a 2-year period to allow any viruses or whatever to die off naturally. They can, quote, steam it, but that has other issues. One of the things, again, planting commercially, either greenhouse or outside, if you're planting an orchard, you're better off planting on a hill because of the frost factor. Frost tends to roll down to the valleys, so if you have a hillside, that means the air is always moving. If you have a valley situation, you tend to have frost later on into the season, and that could wipe out your fruit trees because they're setting right about the time you'll get your last frost, and that's a bad thing. So when planning an operation, whether it's for your home or commercially, you have to look at your soil, you got to look at the terrain you're dealing with and plant the appropriate things, and you'll do fine.
One of the things about New Hampshire in general is we get a lot of rain. We average about 42 inches a year, and most of it comes in this spring and summer, and then our winter snow cover, and those things affect our growing quite a bit here. The snow cover in the winter is very handy because we do get some very cold temperatures. If we have a cover of snow, that acts as insulation and will keep a lot of your perennial plants, whether they're ornamentals or food production, alive. This winter we had a nice string of below zero weather, but no snow on the ground because our snow started fairly late this winter. So a lot of things that normally be very hardy with a snow cover did die, particularly if you're trying to, say, grow something that doesn't really do well this far north, but you've been able to get away with it. Oftentimes in the winter, a really cold winter without enough snow on the ground will kill them. The other thing about our weather, since a lot of our rain comes in the spring and summer, often at 1 or more inches at a time. The week before Memorial Day, we got 8 inches of rain where I live. We had snow over the week. We just missed the snow. We're south of the snow, but we had basically almost a frost. Then we had 8 inches of rain, and then by the next weekend, we were in the mid-90s. So one of the things to help your plants is, as John was talking about watering, ideally it's best to use either in your garden or containers drip irrigation, or if you are watering by hand, don't get the plants wet. Just water the soil. Yes, the plants are designed to handle rain, but if they're constantly wet, even when it's not raining, powdery mildew is a big one. Blights are a big one on the East Coast. So watering just the ground tends to help reduce those problems, or preventing those problems here in New Hampshire. We do get about a couple weeks in the summer where it's really hot, over 90. If your tomato plants and pepper plants drop all their flowers, don't worry. As soon as it cools down, they will start producing again. Along with the cool, wet springs, a lot of gardeners in other parts of the country will mulch all year round. Most of us here in New Hampshire have found that if we pull the mulch off in the spring while it's wet and cool, it helps the soil drain and helps the soil warm up because the mulch will add too much of an insulation early in the spring. Come this time of year, it's great to mulch because it does keep the moisture in the ground as we go into the summer. And some crops prefer mulch to cool the soil in the summer, so you can kind of grow your brassica, your broccoli, your kale and things like that are a little happier with mulch. And then other things, like if you're trying to grow eggplants and cantaloupe, which don't do really well this far north, something like a black plastic mulch that retains the heat in that one localized area can often make the difference of getting your harvest in before the end of the season. Our frost-free season is short. Where I am, it's basically from about May 20th to about September 20th, and I'm in the warm growing area in this state. I don't know what it is for you.
Memorial Day to Labor Day, that's it.
So one of the things that's great about shopping with certified GMO, well, basically they guarantee they don't have GMO seeds, nor the New England companies, is they carry a lot of varieties that work here, that work in our soils. So if you love those big, giant tomatoes, the big, giant beefsteaks, you're really going to need a greenhouse to grow those because they need more than 120 to 140 days. But there's lots of great varieties of, say, tomatoes that will produce from transplanting. I use one that transplants in about 58 days. And so I usually get my first tomatoes mid-July. Last year I got my first set July 7th, which is really early for New England. So one of the things you want to look for when you're picking your planting varieties is stuff that'll basically grow between Memorial Day and Labor Day. Otherwise, you're going to need all sorts of other things to protect your crops from greenhouses, and Dawn uses several other techniques to extend her growing season.
Right, so to extend your growing season, you can do a number of pretty simple things. We have a couple of cold frames, they're called, with some scavenged items from the transfer station. So you need a little bit of wood and glass lid on the top, and in there you can start any kind of seedlings, but I usually use it to grow some cold crops that won't mind the cool weather, like lettuce and spinach, for example. I grow in there. I have 2 small ones, and then I have a taller one that I could grow like kale and broccoli and things like that in it. And then the summer you don't use them, but in the fall, late summer, you start them up again. Or if you have a bigger greenhouse, I've got my heat-loving plants in there, my tomatoes, green beans, and some melons, because the melons can be tough to grow in our season to get nice ripe stuff at the end. I have a friend who uses, not sure if I'm going to say the word right, cloches. For her tomato plants, she'll use like a gallon milk jug. She'll cut the top off, and if there's going to be a frost, she'll go out and put those over each of her individual plants to protect it. You can use simple things too, like row cover or even sheets to cover up your plants on a night where it might get a frost. Can I go on to another topic, or do you want to talk about it? Okay.
The other big great thing about season extenders like row covers, cloaks, cold frames and things like that is they're actually more advantageous at the end of the season, because since we do get early frosts, oftentimes we get an Indian summer after that. So if you can cover up your plants for 1 or 2 days, you can often get an extra 3 or 4 weeks out of production heading into the fall. And also there are quite a few vegetables that you can start in the spring and again at the end of the summer to extend your season. So.
And then I just want to back up to the beginning too, is about your soil. New Hampshire has a wide variety of soil types. A lot of it is going to be rocky. You could have clay soil, you could have sandy soil, or you could be really lucky, like some people who live near the Connecticut River and have Connecticut River Valley soil, which I don't have those problems. I have beautiful soil, so don't hate me. But if you don't have good soil, you can still work with it, amending it. One of the best amendments to add to your soil is compost, which you can make yourself very easily. You can have, there's all different methods. My parents just bury their compostables, which is anything that grows from the earth, in the garden. You can do it that way. We have pallet containers that Bill's put together, just 4 pallets together. You throw all your stuff in there. You need your green stuff, your grass clippings, your weeds without seeds, and your browns. You need your leaves and little twigs maybe, and you need some water and some aeration, and next thing you know, you've got this beautiful black gold, your soil amendment, and that's the best thing that'll help sandy soil or clay soil, and it feeds back what comes out of the earth.
One thing about composting in New England, if anyone's tried it before elsewhere, because we have a very long, cool, wet season at the front and the back of our growing season, making compost is a little harder up here. Leaves take 3 years to break down. So things, building your compost pile, expect it to take longer than other parts of the country. In the South, they can get compost turning in a month or 2. Up here, it usually takes me a year. And I layer, because I don't have a lawn, I layer straw in with all my kitchen scraps throughout the season, and leftovers from the garden and such. So, but the other nice thing is we tend not to need quite as much compost as, say, the South, because we are old mountains that have been slowly deteriorating, and our land is full of all sorts of rocks that have turned into sand. In some respects, though, we do have mineral deficiencies. In general, we tend to have our landscape tends to regenerate. All of New Hampshire was clear cut in the 1800s, and no one planted all these trees. We're very lucky for the fact that the land regenerates and grows trees. And a lot of places just go to desert. Here in New England, we don't, and that's very unusual. But our soils, because this place has been heavily deforested and farmed all these years, we tend to have thin topsoils. Unless you're along the Connecticut River Valley, she's got gorgeous soil. So adding lots of compost amendment and will help your soil over the long run, because you're either going to get clay, which is dense, hard, and holds lots of water, but it's really hard to get your roots to go through, or you have sand with gravel in it. you will find lots and lots and lots of rocks. If you're lucky, they're this big. If you're unlucky, they're as big as a table. And they'll be a couple inches under the ground. But your sandy soils will just drain water and nutrients. Your clay just doesn't give up its nutrients. So one of the things that you'd want to do is get your soil tested. The UNH does it, and there's a couple places online you can send your soil samples to. But New Hampshire's got some very common things about its soil in general across the state. It tends to be acidic, which is great for blueberries, which are native to this area. But other things, you're going to need to add lime to bring up the pH to make it a happier place for most vegetables. Tends to also be low in magnesium, and so that's where the Epsom salts come in for your nightshades. That magnesium is what the plants need to take up calcium. And then other than that, depending on where you are in the state and your piece of property, you could be very low in nutrients, high in some others, but I have a feeling you know more about this than I do.
You can test the soil yourself to UNH, but there's also a private service in the Connecticut River Valley that will go and analyze your soil and actually tell you what nutrients you need and actually mix you a fertilizer you need to bring it right up to snuff. Commercial farmers, myself, whatever, when you get to doing more than 1 acre, it doesn't pay to just go to Home Depot or your local garden center to buy the materials. You now have to buy by the ton, and it makes a difference. And they'll do the exact analysis. Selenium is one of those weak things in our soil. You don't have enough magnesium, and there's a few other minerals depending on where you are in the state. So it's important to have not only pH, but a full mineral analysis. If you're growing strawberries, highly critical to have boron, all right? If you don't have boron, you're not going to get the fruit set. It's just not going to work for you. Other plants require boron, but it's not as critical. When you're doing hydroponics, everybody knows NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, but it's the trace elements. In buying your fertilizer, you got to know what you're trying to get away with. And so in a commercial greenhouse, we're constantly on the watch for the pH of the water solution, mineral content of that, pH of the solution if we're recycling, to add the proper acid, because a plant will only uptake X amount of fertilizer if it's within its pH range. And if over time the solution starts going more acid, you're going to have to add alkaline material, or if it gets too alkaline, you need to add acid material so that the right balance for that particular plant can uptake its fertilizer.
What is the name of that local company?
I don't have it off the top of my head.
Okay, you'll have to get it for me later, because I'd like to go with someone local if I could, and not the university. So there's a couple of different things I've been experimenting. So one of the things I do when I'm not gardening in my own garden is I've been helping other people build and get started in gardening. This year I'm helping two of my friends, one family and another individual friend. And the family that we're gardening with, they have sand for a yard. Luckily, it's on a nice gentle sloping hill heading down into a valley, so that it's a good sunny location and not too worried about frost. And because it's sand, we decided to make raised beds. And we did something called hugelkultur, which is where you bury wood underneath the bed. And the hugelkultur beds have been used for decades and made famous by a gentleman named Sepp Holzer in Austria, though it's a thousands of year old technique. So burying the wood underneath your dirt, your topsoil, and your compost gives you a nice raised bed, but over the years, as that wood breaks down, it acts as a sponge, and it also acts as a place for can you hear me? Any kind of wood. That's a great thing, is when you're clearing a property with crappy pine trees and you really can't do anything, all that, you don't want to bury the needles because that'll raise your acidity, but all that wood can get buried into your garden bed. Some of these garden beds are 7 feet tall with a 70-degree angle. So particularly me, where I've got bad knees and some bad joints, making a raised bed makes it easier to garden and gives you more growing space for your piece of land. The wood, as it breaks down, holds water, and also it slowly breaks down, releases nutrients, and encourages all the little microbes and such that do great, wonderful things to build your soil. They work on that wood over the years. So it's something that I've done for the first time this year. And if nothing else, raising your beds up so you don't have to bend down as much makes gardening much more pleasant.
And further about raised beds, which I love, they're a no-till thing. So you dig them the first year. I mean, I want to try what she said, but the first time we did this double digging method. So you're taking your dirt, you're building up your beds and making pathways in between. And then you never rototill again. You don't ever step on top of your raised beds because that compacts the soil, and that is not a good thing. You want it workable, easy by hand. It's just my little hand tools, and I rake it up and I add stuff on top. And another thing I've learned is about what nature does. You know, nature top dresses. Nature doesn't rototill, and it grows plenty of things by itself. So why are we rototilling up the soil? And another problem with rototilling is you bring up all weed seeds. You bring them up from down below, and now you got another new crop of weeds. Yay. No, it's not yay. But it's great. So we have the beds. We've got drip lines set up. We've got it on a timer. Like every 3 days, it waters for like half an hour with a manifold set up so we can customize which rows are getting watered because some plants will want more water than others. So that works out really well for us.
I like to caution people on using sawdust or wood mulch in your gardens. First of all, sawdust, the way it breaks down, actually robs nitrogen out of your soil. It creates an acidic environment. Too much wood chips, same thing. Wood chips are fine for mulch on blueberry plants, but most of the stuff you're going to grow in your garden that has a 2-year or less cycle, I would stay away from the wood chips mulch. Use straw, use hay, whatever you need to do, but don't stay away from the wood chips. The other thing is watering. A lot of people miss water. They'll think they just cover whatever. A plant is designed for drought. Unless it's a water plant, it's designed for drought. You're better off giving it a good, thorough soaking deep down one day and skip for 3 days than to water it shallow every day. And that way, because if the soil is saturated, the roots cannot pull nitrogen out of the soil. And your plants will start turning yellow because they can't breathe.
Yeah, no, wood chips for mulching gardens work really well in the south with the really, really hot summers, but here in New England, they will pretty much stop your growth, particularly with our wet springs and fall. So, and, crop rotation. Because we do have things like blights and powdery mildew and stuff like that. It's really important in this area because people have been doing gardening here. We've got more pests and diseases on the East Coast than we do in other parts of the country. Apples are a prime example. It's really hard to grow an organic apple here in New England because of so many things attack the apple trees that say don't in Washington State. That's one, because they grow them in desert in Washington State, all with irrigation, because they don't have the pests. So a lot of people use all sorts of things that rotate their crops. Anything that's from a same crop family, like peppers, tomatoes, and eggplants are in the same family. So you don't want to plant those in the same spot as you planted them the year before. Your cucumbers, squashes, and melons with the powdery mildew are particularly susceptible to problems if you plant them in the same spot year after year.
And another reason for crop rotation is because of pests. The same pests attack the same family of plants, so when you're moving them, it makes it harder, allegedly, for the pests to find the plants in the new area. And speaking of pests, we do have quite a few different pests here. I mean, I grow organically. I would never be certified organic because you can do a lot of things certified organic that I would never do in my mini farm. But nonetheless, what my biggest method of dealing with bugs is smushing them. You get used to it. Or a lot of bugs lay eggs on the underside of the leaves of your plants, say squash bugs. They go underneath your squash leaves, and you look underneath the leaves, and you find all these little yellow eggs underneath, and you smush those, so now you're killing the future generations. That's one way to deal with it. There's a spray I like that's just a parasitic kind of thing, the Bacillus thuringiensis, I don't know how to say it, BT is what you call it. You spray that on your plants, and that is great for, in your broccoli, you get those gross little cabbage worms in there, those green things. Ugh. So if you I spray that every week on my plants as a preventative, so I never get those gross green bugs.
There's another technique that Dawn uses particularly for her raspberry bushes. She has chickens. Chickens, if you can do it, chickens are a great addition for your garden, even if they never produce an egg for you. They create some of the best fertilizer. You do need to compost your chicken poo, but they also love to eat things like Japanese beetles, so they're one of the best controls for that. So you get better eggs, the chickens are happy, and you get better produce because they're eating the bugs. Though in the early season you have to be careful because they will wipe out all your seedlings if you let them.
In the commercial greenhouse, we have choices of chemicals. I tend to avoid the chemicals. I use integrated pest management. I examine the type of pest I have and either get ladybugs or some other type of, cure, if you will. Outside gardens, what you can do is, if you have slugs, put out, little pans of beer for them, let them drown in their miseries there. Or if you have the creepy crawlers, use the diatomaceous earth. As they walk across it, they rip open their exoskeleton, and bacteria consumes them within 24 hours.
I wanted to talk a couple of the other techniques for gardening to help, one, save costs, two, make it easier to do some, produce more in a smaller space. One of the things I have is a rain barrel. It sits in my driveway right near my porch, and when it rains, it fills up. It's a 50-gallon rain barrel, and that's basically what I feed my entire container garden with. I currently have about 24 tomato plants. I have 3 containers of 18 green beans. I have about a dozen cucumber plants and about a dozen pepper plants in my driveway. And it takes up about the space of a car. And the rain barrels are nice because if you're, say, where I am with metered water, it pulls the water off. I'm not paying taxes on that water to water my vegetables, which is nice. They're also handy, let's say, if you're on a well, having some rain barrels is nice if you don't have a very high productive well here in New Hampshire, and some people are lucky and some are not so lucky. It's also great water for if you want to just make like a compost tea or a worm tea, which is used as a fertilizer that you spray directly on the plants. Sometimes they need basically the equivalent of an energy drink, especially when we've had crazy weather like this, and you can kind of make your own. Go online, there's all sorts of things to tell you, ways to do it. One of the things I also do with the container garden is vertical gardening. Having things run along the ground, which they can do with our nice wet damp full of all sorts of critters and microorganisms, most beneficial, some not, is that you'll find that your slugs are eating your produce, and you find that you're getting more plant diseases and things like that. Growing vertical gets all that up off the ground. So your plants stay drier, they get more sunlight, and you get more production in the space. So I trellis my containers that have the tomatoes in them, because in containers I get 7-foot tall tomato plants. So I tend to use a bunch of bamboo sticks with Velcro, and I use about 4 bamboo poles per tomato plant, and that works in a container. But in a ground garden, since the plants tend to get even larger, bigger, heavier supports is what I usually use. I'd like to do posts with twine for the taller pieces, and pole greens are another great one that just needs vertical. Peas and cucumbers, you can do squashes. Not the big, like you wouldn't want to do giant pumpkins, but just about anything else. I mean, you can always tie, like, say, a piece of nylon, like from a pantyhose or something, to support your squash if you're worried about it falling, because once they're ripe, they fall off the vine. For most types, not all. But vertical saves you space. It's easier to inspect your plants and harvest because everything is now, closer to eye level, and there's less shady spots along the ground for the pests and critters to survive, and you also save space. There's lots of options for support. When in doubt, make it sturdier than you think, because we do get a lot of thunderstorms with winds here in New Hampshire. But various different kinds of vertical garden save a lot of space. You get cleaner produce, and it's easier to harvest.
You just have the big fence around our garden, so the vertical thing is great. And it's really cool to see butternut squash hanging from the fence, or swan gourds. It's really kind of interesting to check it out. And gardening, you know, anybody can garden, okay? It's full of trial and error, and every year, no matter how many years you've been gardening, like 20, you still make mistakes. I say, well, I won't make that mistake again, but I'll make a new mistake next year, because you try something new, and maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. And one way to get around that, in a way, is I'm working with a couple of my gardening friends in the area, and we're doing like a garden barter. So if I screw up my batch of lettuce, we'll say, they might have lettuce that I can have, and then later I'll get them some strawberries. And one of my friends says, well, I go really good blueberries and you don't, so why don't you give me strawberries and raspberries and I'll give you blueberries? It's like, all right, so I'm doing that with about 4 friends this year, so that's kind of exciting for us.
Dawn and I get together every winter with about another dozen or so friends, and we pool our resources to order seeds. So we save a lot of money because there's seed companies that give you discounts for larger packages or larger orders. So then we just sit around my kitchen table for a couple of hours and divide it up between the dozen of us, and it saves us about half the cost on seeds or more doing that. Also, friends, finding people there. So I've learned a lot over the years from gardening, and because I started down in Virginia, which is different. I've learned a lot from other gardeners like John, who helped improve my tomato plants. But the nice thing about here in New Hampshire is we do have a growing community of gardeners and small farmers. So everyone loves to learn and help and share, especially people who've been gardening over 20 years and know how to handle New England's weather and soils.
Talking about growing differently, I've grown strawberries that I've had since May in our greenhouse at using hanging baskets. So I water 60 plants by a flip of a switch, and a couple minutes later, done, without even walking down the greenhouse. Now I'm harvesting. In fact, there's more than I can eat, which is kind of rare because I really love strawberries. I also experimented this year growing rows of sweet snap peas in hanging baskets. My intent was to grow them to a certain point and then put them on the ground and finish them off with drip irrigation, but they grew so fast that we're having a bountiful harvest. I would walk 10 feet down and fill up my basket with just from that plant, and I still got another 80 feet to do. So indoor gardening can be very intense and profitable.
I also, under fluorescent lights on a shelving unit in front of my south-facing window, do indoor intensive gardening throughout the winter. So I have window boxes and other small pots that I do, like lettuce, herbs, spinach, other leafy greens, which is nice because it's tastier, healthier, and cheaper than buying it at the store. One of the nice things about gardening is no matter how small, like if you have a really small space and you cook with fresh herbs, it totally pays to garden. Because for a couple of even just buying established seedlings will save you money with herbs, because a lot of them are perennials and they'll live for years. One of the things about gardening is what goes into your soil, what those plants have been fed, what has been sprayed on them. So not only are you getting a higher quality taste of your product, but you're going to save a lot of money over the cost of buying organic in the stores. And the nice thing is you can actually preserve a lot of them. So if you get a bumper crop of something, you can dehydrate them, you freeze them, can them. And if you want to really get into it, do root cellar storage. Which the nice thing about the New England basements is it makes it a lot easier to do that, and storing things in a cool, dark place. Unlike other parts of the country that they don't build basements. So. One of the things we want to do is give some time for questions and answers. If anybody would like to ask a question, Bill here has got a microphone, and just put your hand up and we'll answer them for you.
So in your raised beds, if you have a bed that's 7 feet tall, how much of that is dirt and how much is just raised platform?
As much as you put in, and you generally want, I've only built them about a foot high off the ground at this point. There is another gentleman around here who started doing this last year with much taller beds, and I can get you in contact with him. But in general, you'd like, if you can, the dirt that you dig out, if you dig out below a little, ideally you want to have it like at least 8 inches of dirt, soil, and topsoil. Your first year is not going to be the most productive, but after that it gets much more productive.
For all the money that the Department of Agriculture has spent, I asked the question of a researcher at UNH, and I said, what's the optimal container size for plants grown, depending on the plant. And he said, no one has ever done a study like that. So I'm doing that study in my own greenhouses to figure out exactly what's the optimal size of container so that when we do container gardening, there's advantages to it. We know what size we need for the optimal. And difference between commercial and home, you'll actually get more produce at home. Because, for example, lettuce, we typically, to go to market, cut the whole head off. Whereas if you're growing at home, you could just keep pulling the outer leaves for the next 2 to 3 months. So you get a lot more production doing it that way than just killing the plant just to sell in the store. We have romaine lettuce that I grow. I have excess capacity, and that really, all I needed was 50 heads to feed a bunch of people. As long as you keep pulling the sides, that plant's going to last all season.
John does bring up a good point. Some things like broccoli, you cut the main head off. A lot of varieties grow side shoots. Celery, you cut the outer stalks off. Lettuce, pak choi, kale is a great one that grows up in New England. Love kale and rhubarb grow so well up here. But you can keep your harvest going by pulling the leaves off the outer parts. But any other questions?
Yeah, I got a question. I've got a bunch of raised beds, and I have free-roaming cats that come in and try to use it as a kitty litter. Is there a safe, effective way to keep them out?
Yes, I have this problem because I'm in a small urban lot with lots of neighbors having toy cats. Fill every available square inch with a stinky herb. Onions, garlic, basil, rosemary, sage. The little tiny pests don't like them, but it'll help keep your cats out of there. Do not leave any bare soil in your garden at all. Just keep filling it with stuff, and that'll reduce stinky stuff that's great to eat. That'll reduce your problems. But I found that's worked really, really well. It's just to keep any bare spot with cooking herbs or onion family or something like that, which tend to be beneficial for your other plants also. Just keep fennel away from everything because it's allelopathic, and that'll kind of retard the growth of everything else. But yeah, herbs everywhere.
Short marigolds is another good pest repellent. It'll grow around tomatoes. It'll stay low. It won't interfere with your crop, and the bugs really hate it. In fact, that's some of the bug insecticides made out of that.
But try and find specifically French marigolds. The really stinky, the better. The big pom-pommy looking ones, which have less scent, they're not as effective because they're a different family of marigolds. So you try and find the French ones.
My first question about burying wood below your raised bed. How deep do you bury it? Like, do you go
however deep you want. You can bury it 3 feet down. You can just lay it on the top and put the soil over.
Oh, is there an advantage to the 3 feet versus the?
It depends. It depends on how tall you want your beds. If you want your beds to look more like a conventional garden and not too high, so it doesn't freak out the neighbors, you bury more of the wood. If you want a nice tall vertical, so you don't have to bend over, or you don't want let's say you're more Dawn's size than say John's size, you might want to make them slightly shorter so it's easy to pick vegetation off the top. But yeah, it's apparently what I'm reading on it is it all works. It doesn't matter. Just as long as you don't put wood chips and sawdust in there. You want limbs, branches, logs, but not pine needles, because it'll raise the acid in our already acidic soil, and you definitely don't want sawdust in there.
And then the other question I have is the seed distributor.
Oh yeah, you don't want any painted lacquer old style pressure treated wood in there. You want nice, yeah. But you can use regular kiln giant 2x4s that haven't been treated with anything. Those can go in there too.
Sweet. Then the seed place, you said, was it Fetco, like Bubba Fetco?
Wait, can you bring the microphone closer? Can't hear you.
He got the answer. It's Fedco, F-E-D.
Yes.
Like the feds.
Yes. Yeah, it's an acronym for their co-op. Fedco is a good one. High Mowing Seeds in Vermont's another good one. Johnny's Selected Seeds. Those are the three main companies I order my seeds from. Two of them are in Maine. One of them is in Vermont, and I've always had great success. I found things I can't find elsewhere. They're great small family-owned. Well, Johnny's is now owned by the employees instead of the family. But they're all good small local companies to work with, and they do their test trials here in New England, which is really nice.
One of the other things too is that some of these companies offer the greenhouse building kits. Like you all talk about greenhouses, you can build your own greenhouses.
Yes, Johnny Selected Seeds has a great selection of very high quality gardening tools for the small market farmer to the gardener, and they've got a couple of tube bending jigs that are designed to be used with fence posts and fence rail that you can get at Home Depot or Lowe's to build yourself hoop houses and greenhouses. So that's a great way to make an affordable, smaller size, which Dawn has one of these, season extension protectors for your garden. But yeah, and they're also an Albin, I think is how you say it. I don't know, my husband would know, but he's not here. You can go visit their test grounds in Maine, and it's actually a fun trip up there.
You mentioned that you got together with a larger group of people and ordered seeds.
Yes.
Is this an open group?
Well, there's two qualifiers. There's one, we have to know you. And two, we have to be, it's got to be like local area so we can get you the seeds. But yeah, contact me. We could probably, we do open it up to friends. We just, it depends on who's actually gardening and willing to do it with us, because you have to basically decide before Christmas what you're going to grow. Because Fedco sells out early. A lot of these companies sell out of a lot of stuff early in the season. So basically, in general, when you're looking to start your garden, building whatever beds and stuff you're going to do, it's best to do it in the fall because the ground is drier, so it's easier to manipulate the soil. You have more time to add soil amendments. Various things like compost, like mulched leaves, are great. And if you throw all that stuff in the beds in the fall, it gives the worms and everybody else in there time to work on it. Then in the spring, instead of trying to dig through wet, soggy, heavy soil, all you have to do is clear off the mulch you put over the winter, or your cover crop, and clear that out, and plant. So the fall is the best time to build your beds. Right around December, January is the best time to order your seeds. Because our season is later, everybody else down south is already starting their seeds by the time we're even thinking about it. So a lot of the good companies tend to sell out of your favorites, your more unusual varieties. So you want to kind of get an idea and plan in the winter, and ideally order before mid-January to get the best selection.
We bought a grow light this year to start non-GMO seeds, but we didn't have a lot of good luck with our tomatoes. They're just kind of small and spiny. So do you have any suggestions on? I do, because actually last year not this Christmas, past Christmas, my husband did give me LED grow lights specifically for tomato plants for Christmas. One of the things is you need to keep the light about 2 inches above the seedlings the entire time. The other thing is, depending on what seedling mix you're using, most of the seedling mixes designed for sprouting seeds are sterile. So once they start growing and getting their true leaves, you really should transplant them into a nice potting mix, which you can buy or make. And then the other thing is watering from the bottom. So if you have a smaller operation than, say, John, putting your seedling containers in some sort of other tray and pouring the water into the bottom of the tray and letting the plants soak it up. You don't want them sitting in water all the time because the roots will get soggy and wet. So you want to let them be able to drink it up and then be comfortable. But watering from the bottom is really important. The other thing is making sure, as you were saying, that there's airflow. So sometimes I'll have a little fan going on to circulate the air, but keeping the lights close to them and being able to move that light up, watering from the bottom, making sure that the plants have enough nutrients. So if, let's say, you're trying to cheat the season and start a little earlier, by the time I'll usually, if I start tomato plants in March, traditionally, for anything that go in the garden, that goes in the garden, I start April 1st. So if I'm starting something early, I start the seedling, I'll transplant it when it's about that tall, and then when it's about that tall, I'll transplant it again into a 5 or 6 inch pot. But I'm also giving it an organic feeding about every 2 to 3 weeks of, say, something like fish emulsion or compost tea, to make sure it hasn't depleted all the nutrients in the container. Container gardens tend, whether it's your little seedlings or, in my case, I have some 15-gallon pots with a couple tomato plants in each of them,
Because it's in containers, they tend, particularly once they go outside, you tend to lose a lot more nutrients because of the large amounts of watering. So you got to make sure they get enough to eat.
We have tomato plants outdoors, and we get these. Last year we got these very large, like 3-inch green.
Were they green?
Yeah.
Those
very
tomato hornworms.
They had horns on them.
Yeah, they're nasty. They're like as big as your finger sometimes, right? And they've got a spine on the end. They're kind of scary. BT is something you can use to get rid of those. It's you can use it with organic gardening. It's just something that they ingest and then they wither and die. And it's actually, I don't know, maybe a little weird, but I kind of like watching them wither and die because they're so gross. It's like
The other thing is if you see them with like little white rice pods on the back, that one gets to live because it's got a parasitic wasp, I think, that laid those eggs on there, and we want more of those because they'll kill more of them. Since my driveway container garden's fairly small, what I just do is, because they're surprisingly hard to pull off the plants. So I just cut those leaves off and get them out. Oftentimes you will see their droppings that kind of look like little dark brown, gray, blackish, greenish clumps of crusty yuck. It's like a little glob. I don't know really how to describe it. But if you see little brownish, grayish, black blobs, start inspecting your plants. If left unchecked, a hornworm can eat your entire tomato plant in about 2 or 3 days. Top to bottom. They can take out a 7-foot tomato plant. So you want to inspect your plants. I just take a scissors and cut out the leaves that they're on, and that's the end of that. And she feeds them to her chickens, which has to be really gratifying. But yeah, one of the things that you will want to do, regardless of the size of your garden, is inspect it every day, because then you'll be able to catch a problem like pests early rather than later.
I just wanted to say, too, a good reason for gardening is it's good for liberty. All right, we can have our food freedom, take care of ourselves, be self-sufficient. Then we can all be healthy and live a long life and fight for liberty for a long time, okay?
One more comment about that. Right now, New Hampshire produces, is it 5% of its own food?
It's roughly 12%.
Okay. It's approximately 12%. That's still really low. So think about it. Only about 12% of all the food that's consumed in New Hampshire is made here. So whether it's a couple of pots that you can have outside or in your window or on a table under a light, or if you can do an acre of beans and have a bunch of greenhouses, adding any level to your own food freedom is really important. I also like to support a lot of local farmers because one, they provide what I find is a much higher quality product, but it also encourages them to keep innovating and increasing their business so that we can get more food freedom here in New Hampshire.
One of the easiest plants to grow and the most nutritious is kale. That thing will go through frost and keep on living. It generates seed stalks easily, and it's the best all-around plant for here. So if nothing else, I suggest you throw some in the backyard of your rental place. You'll have kale in no time.
Somebody else? Go ahead.
We were hard pressed to find it. Put it closer. We were hard pressed to find a place to plant strawberries, and I finally found a spot, and they're very, very happy. Then I found out that you can only keep them there for 3 years, and you have to rotate them. Do I have to? Because I have no place else to put them.
Oh, you mean rotate them to a new area? Well, like we were talking about, that you need to rotate your crops every now and then. I mean, pests will find them easier if they're staying in the same area and they're taking the nutrients out. So, I mean, if that's the only place you have to use, just make sure you amend your soil well and feed the strawberries, like the foliar sprays. We were talking about the fish emulsion or compost tea, worm tea. Those things would help, or maybe do some in containers. I don't know.
Strawberries is typically not one of those crops you have to rotate. I think if you amend the soil, you're going to be fine. Things like brassica, you have to rotate. The egg plant family, you have to rotate. If you're growing corn, you have to rotate with beans to get more nitrogen back in the soil, because corn's very, very destructive on the soil, just like tobacco is. So you got to rotate those out. But strawberries is one of those that is pretty much, as long as you give it what it needs, you can add to it. You don't really have to rotate it.
Is there any, can we take a last question? Anybody else? Oh, Bill, over here.
I think it only applies to me. What I have in excess in my is in my yard is to use as a mulch is oak leaves. Pretty much exclusively, that's what I do. How bad is that?
Great use for oak leaves. Rake them up, mow them over, mulch them, lay them down on top of your buds in the winter, or dig them in is even better. You'll have to add a little more lime to your soil because they are slightly more acidic. But if you mulch them and either dig them in like just straight up compost, or you can use them as your winter cover over your beds, they're fantastic that way. If you don't mulch them, they will mat down and just stay your oak leaf for like 3 or 4 years. So you gotta mulch them, but they're either great to dig into your beds or use as a winter mulch.
I would be cautious on oak leaves. Oak trees are one of those trees that puts a chemical out that suppresses growth underneath. So if you're gonna compost it, I would leave it for a long-term compost. If you're gonna mulch it, I'd be a little cautious on that, but it is good mulch, but you let nature take its time, but it is a growth suppressant. That's why you see typically...
Yes, it always stays on the bed over the winter. You take them off and you compost them in the spring.
Okay, see, because it'll suppress the growth, okay, and you'll notice underneath an oak tree, there's not much grass growing there, okay, and that's why there's a chemical suppressant that comes out of that.
Yeah, I have maple leaves, which are fantastic to dig into the beds. But yeah, just if you use it just as a winter mulch, and then pull it off and throw it in the its own compost pile. Thank you, everybody.
Songs as I write you this letter, of days past and days yet to come, and the message of freedom. Message of freedom. I stand at the edge of the pages of history and lessons unlearned. It feels like these pages are remaining unturned, but boys, it's no mystery. Children, I'm sorry to leave you this world in a state of disaster. It was given to me in a similar state, but I woke